After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. King George V. Edward VIII was born in Richmond Park, England, at White Lodge House on June 23, 1894. He was the eldest son of the at the time Duke of York, George, and his wife, Mary of Teck. Much like his father had growing up with his brother, Albert Victor, Edward was raised very close to his younger brother, Albert, or as he was called by the family, Bertie. Again, much like his father, a tradition his father in fact started, the boys will go to Dartmouth and begin their training in the Royal Navy. But in 1910, Edward would be separated from his brother when their grandfather, Edward VII, had died. Immediately, the young boy was now made the Prince of Wales, along with the other titles attributed to the heir, the Duke of Cornwall and Rothesay. Like his father, when he became Prince of Wales, he went on a tour of not only the empire, but the world, visiting the United States of America and the Empire of Japan. But when war broke out in 1914, he was of minimum age to go to war. But the Secretary of State for War denied the prince's request to go to France to fight in the trenches. I feel like this isn't really difficult to think why. You know, how would that be if the heir to the British throne was killed or captured by the enemy of England? However, the young man found a way around the denial and made multiple tours of the trenches, witnessing battle in the front lines firsthand. He would actually go on to earn a military cross in 1916 during one of his visits. Now, during the late war, Edward had become very similar to his grandfather, which disgusted his father, the king. The prince had begun an affair with a Parisian courtesan. He would break his affair with her, which would actually be good because a few months later, she would actually be tried for murder in Paris. But he would continue his womanizing and affairs, much to his parents' disapproval. Everything would culminate when he met a two-time American divorcee in 1934 named Wallace Simpson. Now, I know everyone likes to believe that they were the greatest love story ever told, but there is much more evidence that it was an extremely one-sided affection than it was this story of giving up everything for love. In 1935, he would introduce her to his parents, after which they never would meet her again. It's at this time a famous quote from King George V said, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." It was very clear Edward had fallen out of favor, and his younger brother was his father's favored pick as successor. However, on January 20th, 1936, King George V will die. Immediately, Edward was declared King Edward VIII. Now, at first, this all seemed to have been going the correct way. The king was dead, and the new king was declared. But in England, unlike a nation like Spain or Belgium, Edward was the head of state and church. The Anglican Church, or Church of England, was created by his predecessor, Henry VIII, during the Protestant Reformation, as the Church of the Kingdom, then Empire. And unlike the Catholic Church, who had the Pope, the Anglican Church was led by the King of England. Now, the technical head of the church was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at this time was a man named Cosmo Gordon Lang. Now, he was for the king, like most, but he opposed Wallace Simpson being the queen consort. The head of the church could not be married to a woman who was divorced twice. Others, like conservative member of parliament Winston Churchill, did not oppose the marriage, his own mother being an American socialite herself. But the conservative government, led by Stanley Baldwin, did not support the marriage. Prime Minister Baldwin would have constant meetings with the king's brother, the Duke of York, Albert, about the issue. Another issue with the new king was his outlook on the current European geopolitical situation. Deferring from being confrontational, he instead was supportful of the rising German state and on some level admired the new leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler. Also, rumors began that Wallis Simpson was having an affair with the Nazi foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop at the German embassy in London, and that she was also passing secrets from the king's red box that held secrets to the Nazi minister. After months of arguments with not only his family, but the church and government, Edward made the decision that he did not want to rule without the woman he loved by his side. So on December 11th, 1936, not even king for a year, Edward abdicated the throne. He would be declared the Duke of Windsor by his brother, the now King George VI, as his first act as king. This was to be sure his brother was still recognized as a senior royal, but it was actually to keep him away from the reins of power in England. Now, royal dukes were not allowed to run for office in the House of Commons or speak on the floor of the House of Lords, as being a royal duke rather than just a regular duke meant he had to be held to the same standard as the royal family. However, he would still find ways to mess even that up. On June 3rd, 1937, he would marry Wallis Simpson outside Paris in a small ceremony. The couple would stay in France for some time. Also, his brother, the new king, would buy Sandringham Palace and Balmoral Palace from him, because technically those properties were inherited from his father, the king, not inherited from the position. But now the Duke would not make an issue of it, because he still loved his brother and did not want to cause problems. In October of 1937, the Duke and Duchess would do something the opposite of what the English government would want at this point. Under invitation of German Labor Front leader Robert Ley, they would make a private visit to Bavaria, Germany. This was provocative, especially considering the Nazis had constantly been breaking the terms of the Versailles Treaty. That Great Britain had been concerned of. New Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain feared this would make it as if the British government supported the German mobilization and industrialization as war looked more certain. This is why it was meant to be a private visit, but the Nazis made sure it was anything but that. Columns of SS lined the streets of the Bavarian towns, saluting the Duke and Duchess. God Save the King was played as the Duke and Duchess arrived, while onlookers gave the Nazi salute. While there, he would have dinner with Nazi officials, including Goebbels, Goering, Spears, and Ribbentrop. He would visit Berchtesgaden and have tea with Adolf Hitler, and Wallis would have tea with Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. While there, he would tour German factories with Robert Ley, inspect members of the SS, and even tour Dachau concentration camp, which at this time was only being used as an internment camp by reports. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, the Duke's cousin, Louis Mountbatten, returned him to England, where he assumed command as a major general in the British mission to aid the French army. However, with the collapse of the French army under the German Blitzkrieg, the Duke and Duchess, instead of fleeing west with the British army, fled south into neutral Spain and then Portugal. Now, this is when the most damning thing happened in the Duke's life. Now, it had been, up to this point, pretty well known that the Duke was sympathetic towards the Nazis, and many of his courtiers before his abdication were pro-Nazis. It's during this period he would have correspondence with German government informing them that if they should bomb London constantly, the British government would, if shaken enough from the attacks, sue for peace. But also, the Nazis were making a plan. They were never intending on adding England to their Reich. Lebensraum called for the conquest of the East, not the West. But they didn't want the British to continue pestering them in their plans. So an SS Special Operations Officer made a plan known as Operation Willy. The plan was to have Nazi agents, in quote, chauffeur the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to Berlin, and when the Germans defeated England, install Edward back as king with the German occupation to help him maintain order. However, this would not be discovered until after the war. Under threats of execution by Winston Churchill, the Duke and Duchess would leave Portugal and be sent to the Bahamas, where he wouldn't be a threat to the English war effort. While there, he actually served as a fairly good governor of the Bahamas. He would return to France at the end of the war. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did he not go to England? Why did he go to France? Well, in 1945, while Anglo-U.S. forces of the Documentation Corps had set themselves up at Marburg Castle in the German state of Hesse, they were collecting files for record, but also for the trials against Nazi high command coming. Among the files found was Operation Willie, as well as correspondence between the Duke and Duchess with Nazi high command. The British and Americans would seal the files and send them to London, where Winston Churchill would bring them to King George VI and his wife Elizabeth. The king was crushed by the betrayal, and though his brother, there was an unspoken understanding that while the king lived, his brother was not invited back to England, especially with his wife, who had now become in many ways the cause of the pro-Nazism in her husband. Again, the public as a whole at this point did not know of this, as in some ways you can connect horrendous blitz to the Duke's advice of merciless bombing of London. They would remain in France as socialites, living off his allowance from his brother, until in 1952, his younger brother passed away on February 6 at Sandringham Palace. He, of course, was heartbroken, as was his mother, Mary of Teck, who had still been alive. The first thing he did was declare his loyalty to his niece, who was no longer little Lilibet, but now Queen Elizabeth II. He would go to his brother's funeral, where he would give his condolences to his niece and sister-in-law, the latter of whom would never forgive him, stating it was his fault the king had died at such a young age because of the pressure of being king, and that the Duke had forced it upon him. After the funeral, the Duke would return to France, where he and Wallace would continue socializing with the world's greats. They would often meet with the retired Winston Churchill in the French Riviera. He would return to England for the death of his mother, Mary of Teck, in 1953, without Wallace. It's at this time he would speak of not attending his niece's coronation, as he felt it improper that a sovereign or past sovereign should be present at the coronation of the present sovereign. He would instead watch the coronation from France and write articles on the ceremony for multiple publications. He would in later years continue to socialize and meet influential people, including having the Emperor Hirohito of Japan as a guest at his home in Paris. He would have dinner with President Richard Nixon in Washington, D.C., where he would meet Charles Lindbergh, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Arnold Palmer, and the future U.S. President George H.W. Bush. But his health also began to decline. Having surgery in Houston, Texas, for abdominal aorta in 1964, then a surgery on a detached retina in 1965. In 1971, the Duke was diagnosed with throat cancer. In May of 1972, Queen Elizabeth would meet her uncle for one final time. She would talk to him in his bedroom for 15 minutes. However, he was so ill that when a picture was taken of the visit, only Wallace would appear in it. On May 28, 1972, Edward, the Duke of Windsor, died. He'd be flown back to England on a Royal Air Force plane and buried at the Royal Burial Grounds at Frogmore, where his great-grandmother Victoria and great-grandfather Albert were buried. The royal family and government did not think it appropriate that he be buried with his father and mother and brother at St. George Chapel at Windsor Castle. Wallace would die in 1986, and though many British court disagreed, Queen Elizabeth approved her being buried with her husband at Frogmore. Edward VIII was very flawed, as many monarchs are. He was the opposite of his modest father, George V, and brother, George VI. Remember his story as a love story of two crossed lovers. But the truth was, it was anything but that. He was a self-interested man who let his personal politics almost rip England apart, and in a greater sense, Europe as a whole. Thanks for watching. We have some more Kings of Windsor's line to do. I will not do a video on Elizabeth II or Charles III, but though it's fun to do the 3 other Windsor kings. Hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, and comment. And if you are a new viewer, please subscribe. As I always say, I do try to have new content up daily. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.